don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. This episode is another example of our continued experimentation with artificial intelligence. It was generated by Notebook LM, which is a Google product, and I uploaded a PDF of Developing Curriculum for Deep Thinking, The Knowledge Revival, which is an open access PDF publication recently published here in 2025 and with a number of authors, some of whom you will recognize from being previous podcast guests, including Paul Kirshner, Dylan William, and John Hattie. To be clear, this is a derivative of the free download, and you should definitely go to the show notes or do a Google search and find it for your own consumption. It's certainly worth the read and the time. This book argues for a knowledge-rich curriculum based on cognitive psychology, sociology, and educational research. And the authors contend that deep thinking skills like critical thinking and reading comprehension depend on a strong foundation of shared knowledge, challenging the prevailing emphasis on generic skills. They propose a curriculum structured around key concepts and coherent knowledge progression, ensuring equitable learning opportunities for all students. This approach contrasts with previous curriculum models that either overemphasized rote memorization or neglected the importance of foundational knowledge. The book concludes by presenting evidence that a knowledge-rich curriculum significantly improves student outcomes, particularly for disadvantaged learners. Once again, I want to be very clear that this is indeed a derivative of the publication that you can find, and that will be a link in the show notes. But if you find this content interesting, I invite you to join us for a Thought Stretchers podcast live panel salon discussion, which will include Dr. Paul Kirshner, Dr. Claudio Van Hees, and Dr. Daniel Muth, who are all co-authors on this publication. That will be Monday, February 17th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll meet on Google Meet, and you can RSVP to join us and add your voice and your questions at thoughtstretchers.org, which is our Thought Stretchers education community website. There you'll see events, and you can RSVP, and you'll get an email with the link to join us. Again, that's Monday, February 17th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Speaking of events, we have one coming up sooner, which is another live salon kind of discussion. That will be on school choice and vouchers, the good, bad, and the ugly, with author Josh Cowan and Neil McCluskey, who is also an author and director of Cato Institute Center for Educational Freedom, both of whom have been previous podcast guests as well. We also have early bird registration open for our PBL Grow 25 Open Registration Foundations of Project-Based Learning workshop that will be held in Louisville, Kentucky, our home base. That will be June 23rd through 25th. You can find that at wegrowteachers.com/grow25. And if you're interested in the science of learning kinds of content, you'll also want to keep an eye out for an upcoming podcast that will be on the content of cognitive load theory that grew organically out of a social media thread. In that conversation, which will not be live but will be recorded and released as a podcast, you'll hear me hosting Oliver Caviglioli, who's been on the podcast before, Carl Hendrick, who also has been on the podcast, and of course Dylan William, who has been on the podcast, and newcomer Kristen Bachhoff, who has not yet been on the podcast, but I'm looking forward to hearing his perspective on cognitive load theory. We're recording that on January 30th, and we'll be releasing it soon thereafter, so keep an eye out for that. And of course, I invite you to go to our professional development website, which is wegrowteachers.com. There you'll find all of our professional development work, including knowledge-rich inquiry, project-based learning, differentiated instruction, and other things. And you can find our blog pieces there and this podcast as well. As always, you can reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org with any comments, questions, concerns, or otherwise. And now here's that AI-generated conversation that is derived from the Springer Nature publication called Developing Curriculum for Deep Thinking, The Knowledge Revival. Please do download it and take a look yourself. And if you are so inclined, join us for that February 17th salon-style discussion. RSVP for that at thoughtstretchers.org, and here's the conversation.
All right, so we're diving into this whole knowledge-rich curriculum thing today.
Okay.
You sent over some really interesting pieces from this book, Developing Curriculum for Deep Thinking.
Yeah.
Sounds like you're really interested in, how we learn best, and especially how having a strong knowledge base helps with those, thinky tasks that we all face.
It is a timely question.
Right.
There is so much focus on skills and 21st century whatever
Right.
that we have almost forgotten the power of, good old-fashioned knowledge.
Exactly. So let's unpack that. For
Yeah.
this deep dive, let's unpack the arguments for NED against knowledge-rich learning.
Okay.
Using those book excerpts that you sent over and some other research that you provided.
Sounds good.
So one of the things I've heard, people push back against with this knowledge-rich idea
Right.
is that they think of it as just, rote memorization, like stuffing facts into our brains like a computer.
One of the most common misconceptions
Yep.
is that knowledge is just about rote memorization.
Mm-hmm.
Stuffing facts into our brains like a computer.
Right. And I think some of us have, those memories from history class or whatever where it really did feel that way.
Yeah.
But you had to remember all the dates and battles.
Right.
But you didn't necessarily understand the why or how.
Yeah, this book is arguing for something much deeper.
Okay.
They use the analogy of a schema, like a mental web.
Uh-huh.
Imagine you're learning about, say, photosynthesis.
Okay.
If you already have a solid schema for basic plant biology, roots, leaves, sunlight, that new information about photosynthesis has somewhere to stick.
So it's not just about, cramming isolated facts. It's
Yeah.
about creating that, framework,
Yeah.
a mental architecture where new knowledge can be integrated and understood.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this leads to some pretty compelling arguments in favor of this approach.
Okay.
The authors really emphasize that a solid knowledge base actually makes those higher-order thinking skills, critical thinking, problem-solving, easier.
Now that seems counterintuitive.
Yeah.
You'd think the more knowledge you have to juggle around in your head, the harder it would be to do those things.
Right. Think about it this way.
Okay.
Your working memory is like a mental scratch pad.
Uh-huh.
It has limited space.
Right.
But if you have a ton of knowledge already stored in long-term memory,
Okay.
you can chunk information together,
Okay.
freeing up space in your working memory.
So, if I'm trying to understand a really complex article about, say, international trade,
Yeah.
it helps if I already have a good grasp of, basic economic principles.
Exactly. And the book uses this brilliant example about solving a chemistry problem.
Okay.
Experts can chunk information based on their prior knowledge, making the problem way less mentally taxing.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's like having a mental shortcut.
Okay, so more knowledge makes your brain work better.
Exactly.
But I think people still have those concerns about knowledge-rich learning.
Right.
Just turning into those boring memorization drills.
And that is a valid concern.
Nobody wants kids just, regurgitating facts without understanding.
Right.
The book acknowledges this.
Okay.
They argue that it's about building skills within specific subjects. Like, you are not just learning the names of all the bones, you're learning how they function together as a system.
So it's not about facts in isolation. It's about building deeper understanding through those facts.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the book uses some interesting examples to illustrate this.
Okay.
It contrasts a traditional fact-heavy history curriculum with a more competency-focused science curriculum from Wales.
Okay.
And then it brings in this thing called the primary knowledge curriculum, or PKC.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me because you're actually a former elementary school teacher.
Yeah.
What's your take on the PKC as a real-world example?
The PKC is intriguing because it takes this knowledge-building idea and puts it into practice.
Okay.
They're very deliberate about building knowledge cumulatively.
Like ensuring kids have the foundational knowledge in earlier grades to grasp more complex stuff later.
So it's not just a random assortment of topics, it's strategically sequenced.
Right.
Kind of like you need to understand simple addition before you can tackle algebra.
Exactly. And the PKC also uses these big ideas to structure learning,
Okay.
like the concept of trade.
Okay.
Imagine students starting with something concrete, Roman marketplaces in early elementary.
Oh, okay.
Then they moved to river trade, eventually getting to global trade by upper elementary.
Wow. So the big idea is that, like, through line.
Yeah,
And the complexity and depth increases as they go.
exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
It's not just about covering a million topics superficially. It's
Yeah.
about going deep within a few well-chosen areas.
Right.
And what's really compelling is they've done some pretty extensive research on how this impacts student achievement.
Okay, let's dive into those findings.
Okay.
What did they discover?
So they implemented this knowledge-rich curriculum in 14 U.S. charter schools, starting way back in kindergarten. And after 4 to 7 years, the results were pretty remarkable.
Oh, okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. Spill the tea.
Reading scores jumped a whopping 16 percentile points.
Wow.
That's like moving from average to the top tier internationally.
Wow, that is significant, but charter schools often have, different demographics or resources, right?
That's true. But here's the kicker. In one low-income school that implemented this curriculum, they completely eliminated the achievement gap
Whoa.
in reading, science, AD, math.
Now, that's what I call leveling the playing field. So
Yeah.
are they saying that a knowledge-rich approach is the key to educational equity?
It's certainly compelling evidence, and it ties into a bigger conversation about the types of knowledge that we prioritize in education.
Okay.
This book touches on the influence of, neoliberal ideas,
Uh-huh.
where skills and employability become the main focus.
Yeah, so that's all about, prepping for the workforce, almost like knowledge for its own sake has become less valued.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of powerful knowledge comes in.
Okay.
Some scholars argue that certain types of knowledge are more powerful because they give you deeper understanding and critical perspectives.
Interesting. Okay, give me an example of what you mean by powerful knowledge.
Think about history.
Okay.
Not just dates and names, but understanding cause and effect, analyzing different perspectives on historical events, grappling with ethical dilemmas of the past.
Okay.
That kind of knowledge can be truly transformative, especially for students from marginalized groups.
So it's like giving them the tools to question the dominant narratives, to see the world through a more critical lens.
And that kind of critical thinking requires a solid foundation of knowledge.
Right.
This brings us back to curriculum coherence,
Right.
how we structure learning so it builds on itself in a meaningful way.
And the PKC is a good example of that, right? With its big ideas and intentional sequencing.
And remember that trade example we discussed? It starts simple in concrete marketplaces, then progresses through river trade to the complexities of global trade. Each stage builds on the previous one, allowing students to grapple with more nuanced ideas as they go.
And you mentioned you were an elementary school teacher. Did you ever try to implement anything like that big idea approach in your own classroom?
I wish I had known about this back then.
Yeah.
We were so focused on covering every single standard
Right?
that there wasn't much room for that kind of deep dives into a single topic.
I can imagine it must be tough to balance those curriculum demands with the desire to foster real understanding. So if a teacher did want to incorporate more of this powerful knowledge and build things coherently, where would they even start?
It requires a real shift in mindset.
Okay.
It's about moving away from just covering content and towards cultivating deep understanding.
Okay.
The PKC, for example, highlights the distinct disciplines history, science, art, but also emphasizes the connections between them.
So it's not about learning subjects in isolation. It's about understanding how they interrelate, how history influences scientific progress, how art reflects societal values, and so on.
Exactly. And that kind of integrated learning is much more engaging for students.
Mm-hmm.
They can see how knowledge is relevant to their lives and to the world around them.
But it's not just about the curriculum itself, right? It's also about how it's taught and assessed.
Absolutely. We can't just lecture at students and expect them to magically absorb this powerful knowledge.
Right.
We need active learning, discussion, debate projects that challenge them to apply what they're learning.
So rote memorization and standardized tests are out.
They have their place, but they can't be the only measure of understanding.
Okay.
We need assessments that require critical thinking, analysis, creativity.
This makes me think about my own learning experiences. The classes I remember most vividly are the ones where I got to do something with the knowledge, not just passively absorb it.
And that's what we want for all students.
Yeah.
Right? To see knowledge as a tool they can use to make sense of the world, to solve problems, to make a difference.
Right.
But let's be real, implementing this kind of knowledge-rich curriculum is no walk in the park. There are some serious obstacles.
Like what kind of challenges might schools face?
Well, for starters, the sheer volume of knowledge out there is overwhelming. How do you choose what's essential? How do you avoid overloading students?
Right. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose of information.
Exactly. That's where careful curriculum design is so crucial. Prioritize the big ideas, the foundational concepts, and avoid getting bogged down in minutia.
Okay.
But then you run into the time crunch.
Right.
Teachers are already stretched thin.
Yeah.
How do they fit this all in?
Especially with the pressure of standardized testing looming over everything.
Exactly. We need to rethink those accountability systems and create space for deeper learning. But that requires a systemic shift, a change in the entire educational landscape.
So it's not just about individual teachers or schools adopting this approach. It's about a broader cultural shift where we value knowledge and understanding as much as, if not more, than test scores and job skills.
You hit the nail on the head. It's a big task, but not impossible. We need teachers, administrators, policymakers, and parents all on board.
And maybe even podcast listeners spreading the word about this powerful knowledge revolution.
Exactly. We all have a role to play in shaping the future of education.
Okay, I'm fired up. Now, this has been so insightful. But before we wrap things up, I'd love to hear your take on one more piece of the puzzle. We keep coming back to this tension between building a strong knowledge base and, making sure that kids don't just become these little robots spitting out facts.
Right.
How do we make sure that a knowledge-rich approach also fosters creativity and adaptability?
That's the balancing act, isn't it? And the book dives into this directly. Remember those schemas, those mental webs we talked about? When knowledge is structured that way, it becomes inherently more flexible, more adaptable.
So it's not about memorizing isolated bits of information. It's about understanding how those bits connect to a larger system, a bigger picture.
Exactly. And when kids have that kind of deep understanding, they can start to make connections on their own, draw inferences, apply their knowledge to new situations. That's where creativity comes from. The ability to see things in new ways, to combine ideas in unexpected ways.
Okay, that makes sense. But wouldn't the curriculum itself need to be designed in a way that encourages that kind of creative thinking?
Absolutely. It's not enough to just throw a bunch of facts at kids and expect them to become these innovative thinkers. The book talks about this idea of a knowledge-led approach to curriculum design.
All right, you've piqued my curiosity. What exactly does knowledge-led mean in this context?
It means the curriculum is structured around the core concepts and principles of a discipline. You're not just randomly picking topics or chasing the latest educational trends. You're intentionally building a learning progression that leads to deep understanding to mastery.
So it's about being deliberate, strategic. Like if we're teaching history, we're not just hopping from ancient Egypt to the Renaissance to the American Revolution. It's about choosing those topics and sequencing them in a way that makes sense.
Exactly. And it's also about being thoughtful about assessment. Are we testing for rote memorization, or are we truly assessing understanding?
Right. It's not just about how many facts kids can recall. It's about whether they can apply those facts, make connections, solve problems.
You're getting it. And this is where things like project-based learning debates, simulations, those types of activities can be really powerful. They allow students to demonstrate their understanding in a more meaningful way.
It seems like technology could play a role here too, providing access to more information, connecting students with experts around the world, facilitating collaboration.
Technology is a tool, right? Like any tool, it can be used effectively or ineffectively. The key is to be intentional to make sure it's enhancing learning, not distracting from it.
So maybe instead of banning cell phones from the classroom, we're using them to research primary source documents or create multimedia presentations.
Exactly. It's about leveraging technology to support those higher order thinking skills, to foster collaboration, to make learning more engaging and relevant.
This all ties back to what we were talking about earlier, preparing students for a world that's constantly changing, a world awash in information.
We can't predict what specific knowledge will be most valuable 10, 20 years from now, but we can equip students with the critical thinking skills, the intellectual curiosity, the ability to evaluate information and adapt to new situations.
So it's not about stuffing their heads with facts that might become outdated. It's about nurturing those lifelong learning habits, that love of knowledge for its own sake.
Beautifully said. A knowledge-rich curriculum, when done right, isn't a destination. It's a launch pad. It's the beginning of a lifelong journey of exploration and discovery.
I love that analogy. And for you, our listener, we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought, whether you're a student, a teacher, just someone who loves to learn. Remember, knowledge is power, but it's also a source of joy, wonder, and endless possibility. So keep asking questions, keep diving deep, and never stop exploring the incredible world of knowledge that's out there.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.